Welcome to Movement Lesson, the place where optimal development begins.
Okay, so I did a presentation in Prague, Charles University. It was really talking about the difference between movement and motion, going over those laws, and I have the presentation. I'll have to connect it to another video. It goes into more detail with all of these slides, but in particular, with you being here learning about movement lesson, you may feel like, why with what I'm about to share, you may feel like it's really irrelevant to what you're about to learn. You want to get into just helping your child thrive and develop. And, what does the mathematics matter? What does all this matter? Movement versus motion, things like that. Really, the big thing is that there's a ton of modalities out there, therapies, things like that. And everyone's claiming different things, claiming science, backing of science. A lot of people focus on the brain, neural mapping, things like that, which definitely has its place. But at the same time, why and how do you recognize truth from error as far as just human error in what we understand? I mean, you just see it happen over and over again in history where we think we have this understanding, and it isn't until, it's proven wrong that something is or is not, or proven wrong or right, is or is not what it is. And so it can get really confusing as a parent, professional, even as a caregiver. How do you know what will best help your child? And for me, I just had a spiritual experience with movement lesson. I didn't have a lot of time, resources, money, had a very severe child with special needs, and I just needed to make my time count. And so I just said a prayer, asked for guidance to find the things that would help my daughter thrive and give her her best possible future. And when I found movement lesson, tried out my first lesson, which was literally just helping my daughter breathe. Most people don't come in at that state of do or die breath. Michelle will often refer people to doing the breathing course, but I didn't have that available. And I was in like survival mode for my child, and we needed to extubate again. We had a DNR, and I just really had no other options, and I ran out of therapeutic and medical options, and I needed something that I could do. And so it was really powerful to me that Michelle could share something with me, and like I can make a difference with my child. And so this is just part of that presentation. I'm not going to go over it. I mean, I am going to go over it in some detail. The premise of it was to help redefine movement versus motion. They are kind of used interchangeably in the science world. They do have definite differences of them. But unfortunately for you, everything in science is based off of laws of motion, and movement fits within it, but there's a lot of confusing things that can't be explained, and it's because we have laws of movement at play versus laws of motion. And so going into this, helping you see the difference between motion and movement, but also giving validity to these things that Michelle shares. She always talks about that first breath. If your child doesn't get that first breath, everything else builds off of that. You can't go into vertical milestones well, things like that. Or if you want to go into vertical milestones and your child's struggling with breath, like you got to work on breath. And as I've studied the mathematics, like the things that she is saying, I'm like, oh, like for one, like, oh, she's right. Like, I mean, I believed it, but now I know it. But I really didn't have context or understand like what that meant. So, it's my hope that even if you've watched this far in this video, that you'll continue to watch it. You don't have to know the mathematics. You're going to watch and be like, I don't even get what that means. But it's a good baseline to at least just have in your mind. This is something to watch over and over again. Anything in movement lesson is to watch over and over again. You're not expected to get it the first time. You're not expected to like come in and absorb it all. You have one focus of what you're trying to learn, and you just try to get that out of the videos. And then when you have another question, you may go through the videos again, and you're just trying to get context and understanding to that one question. That's where real learning happens and things like that. When we try to focus on everything and learn everything, we will learn nothing and we get overwhelmed. And so this is showing a big picture, showing just, why it works. It's so cool. And why Michelle just says movement lesson is a lesson in movement. But if you don't know what movement is, like, that really isn't a profound statement to you. And so it's my hope that this will give you insights and stuff like that and help you understand that, the big reason why you're here is you're seeing your child do things of motion versus things of movement. And you just subconsciously know that that's not optimal. You could have anywhere from a typical child that's just, things aren't like, you just can tell things aren't as optimal as you would like them to be, right? You could have atypical where they're still they're still on track with development. They could still have a great successful life, but you still can just tell that they're a little bit more awkward. They're like, things are just taking a little bit longer for them, and everyone's like, oh, chill, babies will develop at their own pace. Like, it's not that the baby's developing at their own pace. They're showing that optimal is not happening in their system. And if you want optimal movement in their system, you're going to have to input it because it's not happening on its own. And so that's really what movement lesson allows you to do. So I did this presentation as I've been in movement lesson. Like, my first question was, how do I teach my baby movement from the beginning? Because I just had a child that, like, we didn't even have first breath. I mean, she was on life support. And as I've studied movement lesson, I'm like, well, what is the difference between movement and motion? Because Michelle keeps saying, this is a lesson in movement, but I'm like, I don't know what that means. And so ultimately with, I started movement lesson in 2017. I ultimately have come to the conclusion that motion is everything that movement isn't, and movement is superior to motion. So what is movement? And I've had my 8 kids to, really be able to troubleshoot and test thoughts and test Michelle's theories and, my own, where I'm like, okay, if Michelle's saying this and I'm doing the mathematics, then I have to have this. And I've been able to go and practice on my kids and see various results. I'm about ready to expect my 8th child, which currently has been tested positive for Down syndrome. And it's been interesting as I've been pregnant with him. One of the key differences that I've noticed with him, with my other kids, is like, all my kids have really been inside of me as I've been pregnant with them, and people be like, oh, it's your 8th kid, like, you're gonna stick out more. But with him in particular, he's really just seems to, like, fall out of me. Like, I don't know how else to explain that, but he seems to go away to me. Like, he's not binding with me, even in utero, and even with my other, my SMA kids. Her in particular, she just sank into into my pelvic floor. Super painful pregnancy, and baby shouldn't sink in utero. Just really painful hips with her, and with this daughter. It was more so, I just felt a lot of, like, tremoring in the system while I was with her, or while I was pregnant with her, and she ended up having a seizure disorder. And she tremored right after birth. I'm like, oh, that's what the shaking was. I didn't know it, seizure related, but or a precursor to it. But I still hope the baby doesn't have Down syndrome. There's still a chance. But regardless, even if he doesn't, that there's still, I already know there's still an issue with his binding force, and that's just something I can work on. And so if I have a child that's more typical, that's just something I can work with. If it's Down syndrome, then that just might be something in the genetics, things like that. But even with my typical children, I've worked with all of them. Him in particular, these 3 are all carriers of SMA. They don't have the actual disease, but and she's not one. And so they all have their little quirks, things like that. And I just want to optimize them. And so him in particular, he was just really heavy as a child. He still tends to be heavy chested, things like that. But with movement lesson, I've really been able to optimize that. I mean, and all these guys have become like super kids. They are well beyond anyone in their grade. And I would attribute a lot of that to movement lesson, not just because they're smart, but they're getting optimal development in. their system. And even with Alice here, she was definitely not on track for optimal development. She was tracking okay according to like CDC, things like that, rolled over about 6 months old. But I was working with her a lot and still just being like, man, why can't I get these movements to happen? I could just feel a lot of stiffness, especially like in her shoulders, which could have just been way like the doctors had her come out. And I've noticed with all my kids, I didn't have an epidural with her. I had like a half an epidural with her, and then full epidurals with these two. But something that I noticed is that, the doctor's really trying to not, you don't want to tear. They're trying to make it so you don't tear. When I had to push her out, man, I had to push her out. She was going out like it was fast. But because of the epidurals, there can be a little bit more control in that process, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And Michelle really emphasizes the importance of rotation and the birth when the baby comes out. And he in particular, the cord got stuck around his shoulders, so they had to like push him back in and bring him back out. But then they also like brought him out slow versus like really quick and fast rotation. She had more of that quick and fast rotation because I only had like a half an epidural with her, and the doctor's like, don't push. And I'm like, yeah, I'm pushing. Like, this hurts. And then with her, she actually got stuck on my hip. The baby here, she got stuck on my hip. And so, still that birthing process got interrupted, even in a minor way. I've been able to optimize all of their development as well as all these other children here. And so, I've really, apart from working on my own children, I've worked on other children, adults, and these principles work on optimizing anyone. The only time it doesn't work is when someone believes it doesn't work, and it just won't work. And that's also a mathematical component. It's really important for the beginning of movement to happen, is that belief. And if you don't have belief, well, nothing mathematical can start to come to fruition. And so, but anyway, so here, working with that, I presented laws of movement versus laws of motion, laws of movement versus laws of motion. And I'm not necessarily going to read through this. What's really important between these two is that, things that are of motion or things that are acted upon versus things in movement can act for themselves. And so while there are still these laws of motion in things that have, while there still are these laws of movement in things that have motion, it really just depends on the level of intelligence that something was created with. If it was intended to be something that was acted upon versus something that can act for itself. And in the case of a human being, we were made to act for ourselves. And so we have more prominent these laws of movement in our bodies. As we look at the first law of movement, that very initial starting point, everything, all the mathematics have to be here at the beginning, at the moment of conception, not just with babies, right? With anything. At the moment of conception, the blueprint for what is intended in the end has to be there. And, that's in science, that's why they really struggle with singularity. And they talk about, this mass density and all this stuff being here in the very center and where we all came from. And they can't put a mathematical component to it. And it's really, the mathematical component is dependent on the outcome that is intended. This starting point, this point of singularity is really the blueprint of how to use the resources around you to create XYZ thing. Knowing the beginning from the end, or knowing the end before you start, is really a key component in movement. And it applies all across the board, whether you're in business, personal development, any subject that you can think of. If you use these laws of movement, you can create progress and progression in something you're trying to accomplish. But here we're focusing on the human body and how movement plays a role in that, and how you can start understanding when your child is moving versus when your child is having experiences of motion. And it's really hard not to say motions of movement or movements of motion, because it just gets confusing. Because the two really shouldn't be used interchangeably, which, science tries to not do that either. But at the same time, you still, even when they're describing things of motion, they still use move, like the word move a lot. And, going from point A to point B is not movement, that's motion. It's how we get from point A to point B is whether or not we have movement coming into play. And so looking at that first point that, that seed, I actually come back to a seed. A seed has the blueprint needed to create a tree, to create a plant. Like the purpose is already known before the seed even begins to sprout. And so at that moment of conception, all the principles and mathematics of movement should be there to allow it to achieve an end. And, in the human seed, that's where we have our DNA. Our DNA is that blueprint that uses the resources around it to actualize the blueprint of the DNA. Now, if something's off with the DNA, well, then we start to see those deviations or breakdowns of movement, and they can show up in utero. They can show up after the fact. It just depends on how long that body can sustain things of movement before the laws of motion start playing a more superior role in the person. And that was one of Michelle's big ahas, is realizing that anyone with any type of special needs or any type of just lack of development, even if it's not special needs, it comes down to the rotation in their system, the quality of that rotation. And so that's why she really emphasizes that rotation, and the gentle touch penetrates the system to this very singularity level that we can start making changes in the blueprint of what makes your child move and function. And so thankfully you don't have to, like, yes, it helps to have intent, but at the same time, you can be so amateur at this and have amazing results. I mean, that's where I started. That's where Michelle started. When you have gentle touch and rotation, you just see amazing things. And so working with that, you'll see that based off of these laws of movement, we start to create the movement structure, which in essence comes from that blueprint, right? That DNA or that roadmap of what our intended outcome of this being is supposed to be. And so, again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but just starting to show the mathematics of how this all works. Those are, we use a lot of different mathematics. We probably use like all the mathematics. But a really key thing here that I show, and Michelle talks a lot about binding force, right? Getting that binding force. That binding force is really, really important. What I couldn't show in this picture, I mean, I do have a little video that you can see, but here you have this unit here, okay? And when we get binding force, it's these cones, basically these vortexing cones, they're rotating in opposing directions, and when they meet, okay, this starts to create our movement structure, the seed of our movement structure, or it defines it, okay? Which it's already there. Again, this is just when the blueprint is put into action, okay? This is going to create a certain timing in the system, and maybe a good way to put that would be like the heartbeat, right? When the heart starts beating, this binding force has really started to set up in the system. This life form now has a time frame in which it can survive, and it can be something that's infinite, or it can be something that's not infinite, depending on the quality of the movement structure that is there. And being here at Movement Lesson, we have the opportunity to enhance the quality of the mathematics, and therefore change the timing in the system to be more optimal, to be more infinite in your child's system or your client system. Again, whether you're working on an infant to anyone that's elderly, we can work with these principles. And so this, though, is really, really important and plays a really huge role in the first breath that Michelle talks about. I think I actually talk about it more in the presentation, but I'm not going to go into huge detail right now. But this is a really, really important part. And I think it's called the torus, but you'll see in a lot of like people who study math and who are trying to understand the universe, things like that. They'll show an object, but it actually, these cones actually come here, clear here to the center, and they meet at the point of singularity. And so what they can't see, though, is this point of singularity is actually quite small. It can be quite small. But it also can be something quite large, okay? I'm not going to go into details with that. Maybe I will, but what's hard to see in math is that you don't, or in science and when they're trying to study these molecules and things like that, is that you don't see this breadth factor in there, okay? You don't see the breadth of the system and how it is creating the vortex, the vortices that allow the system to be self-sustaining. And so this is just a really important piece of that. And so in the presentation, I actually showed like this being created, stuff like that. But what's really cool is even at this point, the mathematics should be set up in the system. Again, at the point of conception, the mathematics should be there. So if there's a flaw in the mathematics, the blueprint of the seed isn't going to come to fruition like intended. And so we need to optimize the mathematics and optimize the blueprint so the outcomes can be more of what we want. And so so this is just really cool when we talk about even at conception, when the baby starts to grow in utero, this is being set up. And if it's off, even at that point, it throws off the movement structure. And so so plays a really important role. And then when the baby's going from in utero to into the world, into gravity, Michelle talks about that. This is really important to regulate the system so it can transition from the in utero state to having more forces acting upon it. It's really important for the body to be able to regulate the forces around it. And again, do you need to know all those mathematics, all those, like, no, you don't. But at the same time, coming here to movement lesson, why does it work? Why, like, it's this is why it works. And hopefully just gives you more faith in staying with it, even when it gets hard or you don't understand and you're like, what do I do next? Like, that's the whole point of the support programs, okay? And so this is just a really important piece of it. And so here's showing you that. And then in another video, I actually might do it in the next video just so that you have it for reference. But I show you how the movement structure builds. So in this particular video, like, I'm just putting the movement structure there, and the first half of it there, and I'll build the other part of it. But just to save on time. But in the next video, you'll actually watch me build this initial part with these circles and stuff like that and go from there. So so this is what I'm talking about here. And this actually shows a lot of the mathematics. But if I have this spread out more, you can't really see this very well. And it just makes it really, really challenging. So so I have it up big. But really still talking about like this first breath. One of the things that Michelle talks about is breathing balance. And heart function. What does that have to do with, movement versus motion? It's just how it all starts setting up in the system. Now, the big thing why I go into this is we're looking at movement versus motion is, a lot of parents will come in and they'll be like, okay, well, I want my kid to stop stimming, or I want to work on constipation, or I want to work on walking, or like they want to work on all these skills. And it really comes back to the foundations. If you improve the foundations, everything else builds upon that. It's like a pyramid, right? And the better my base is, or the longer it is, and the more sustainable it is, the more I can grow on top of that. But if I start losing my foundation for any reason, I worked on an adult, and I actually just saw her today, but she first came to me and just like she couldn't breathe, and pretty much, she's in her 60s, I think, maybe 50s. But anyway, she had a foundation in her triangle like this, but because she couldn't breathe, like she literally was losing her baby milestones, like she was losing these mathematics quite quickly, and she was aging really fast. And so I had to go in and reestablish these foundations, and even give her better foundations than what she had before. Even though she grew into a full-fledged functional adult, she has passive income, works on a farm, like, just amazing at what she can accomplish. But all of our systems can be optimized, but they also can break down for any reason. And so, I really have pondered Michelle's concepts of breathing balance and heart function, because we can go in and work on even the mathematics of development, but if we don't have breathing balance and heart function, we don't have those structures, we can't progress. And so when you're being asked to work on these things, working on it for a week and being like, okay, well, now my kid should be fine, like, why aren't they doing XYZ thing? Like, this is a lifelong skill that you're learning to continually optimize the system. And sometimes you'll need to be working on and focusing on the life functions more, and other times you can be really focusing on these milestone foundations more, the movements of them. And then when you get this part down, from there, the rest of development, even though it starts to become complex, it's not complex because we're building off of the simplicity of these planes. And thankfully, you're just going to learn these things one at a time. But even what we're going to cover with breathing balance and heart function, you're not going to get into those mathematics here. Like, that's not what you're going to work on first. Like, Michelle has like her breathing course. Okay. But you're not doing mathematical, like, you are doing mathematical things of breathing, but you just have to start that the intuitive way. Like, it will just completely overwhelm your brain if you start trying to do the technical aspect of it. But I still want to show you that it's there, why that breathing course works, why, how is this working on your balance? Because balance ends up being a plethora of things that need to be in balance. But working on that balance structure, it's you're working on it intuitively within the courses, even though it's never actually like defined. But working on balance in such a technical way, that's going to be a little too advanced, especially if you're just starting. But I still want you to know that the mathematics are there, that you end up working on them, even though you don't know how or why or what's ever going on. You may have a child who needs more focus and intent there. But it's just been really cool, even working with my daughter. Like, again, I need my time to count. And just being able to focus on, I've been doing it for almost 7.5 years, I think that thing said, coming up on 8 years. And I just now started really focusing on the actual mathematical structures of breathing balance and heart functions. And I've had a lot of success not focusing on those things and working on these other extra components. Even this particular part of the movement lesson, the technical aspect, has only been within the last 2 years. So my first 5 years of movement lesson, I really was just doing what Michelle said, and I had awesome success at home. And I didn't feel like it was Michelle's success, but I saw changes in my child. My goal is that I wanted to become like Michelle. I wanted to work on my kids like Michelle. And people tell me, like, no, you need to be you and your individual. Like, I'm still going to be me. I'm still going to put the parts and pieces of what I've learned. But if I'm not mathematically, if I'm not true to the mathematics of what creates movement, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. Like, I'm not optimizing the system. I'm not optimizing it in movement. I may be optimizing it in motion, which that's where when you're having therapies focus on like muscle strengthening, things like that. And even going into neural mapping and repetitive patterning, that can be borderline. Okay. That can be borderline. And so it really just depends on what you're working on, but you just won't know that if you don't know the difference between movement and motion. And even with this video, you may still end it and be like, I still don't know what the difference between movement and motion is. But at the very end, I hope to give you a very clear and concise definition of what it is. I mean, clear and concise would be movement is everything, or motion is everything that movement isn't. So to know what things of motion are, you have to know what movement is. But even then, I'd give a little bit better, I'd give a little different definition even from that, to try and just help you start wrapping your mind around, okay, when I'm observing my child, what am I seeing? Okay, so that's something to be looking for at the end of the video, is that definition. But in the meantime, to understand what movement is, or to understand what motion is, you have to understand what movement is, and motion is everything that movement isn't. And so, so here, when we're working with this, we have our movement structure. Okay. And in here, I have the sleeping and lying down milestone, tummy time milestone, looking at you milestone, rolling over. It's going to be these pink ones. Grabbing the feet is going to be these light blue ones. Coming to sitting, these green ones. And I don't have the peripheral planes on here, or the arc planes, or the box planes, just because if I put those on there, then these other parts that I'm going to show you looks confusing. But these are just, I'll add those later so you can see it within context of how it all works. And when, even right here, you might be looking at it and being like, oh, that's already really complex. Like, you learn these one plane at a time, literally taking this red line, and you're learning just that one particular part. And as you go through the courses, they build on each other. So you're not starting with this complex thing. Movement is a lot of simple that creates complex. It's the combination of a lot of simple things that allows for an infinite amount of possibilities. And so going with this, I do want to show that if you do watch the presentation that I did in Prague, I just want to show you these cylinders in context here. So here you go. We've got these cylinders. I just want to make sure these dots are where they need to be. Okay. So these cylinders in context from that presentation, and how our movement structure, this circle is in the very center of that. But I'm not going to leave those there. Might bring them back at the beginning or at the end. So as we're looking at our movement structure, just to put things in context, for those who may be mathematical, things like that, they really talk about us in dimensions. And one of the key things that I want to clear up, they say we live in the 3-dimension. They found the brain in like 17 dimensions. I don't know, a lot of dimensions. You'll hear this word dimension and, people trying to explain what it would look like in the fourth dimension, things like that. The myth that I want to clear up is that we should be multi-dimensional beings. We should be infinite. And when you're looking at math and you're starting to see geometric figures, those are shadows of rotation that's happening within the system. So if you look at this movement structure, what's really cool is you can see what they use to try and explain the fourth dimension, but it's there. They see those shapes because it's the shadows of the structure, and even then they still don't see the big picture of it. And so okay, so you have the structure here, and I actually just did a quick Google search of it because I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the word right, but it's this tesseract, I think. But the fourth dimension. So you can see here that they have a cube within a cube. You're seeing these lines here. Seems like I was at the Prague convention, and I think in Feldenkrais they had this concept of the box that they used, and talking about the dimensions that we live in. We should be multi-dimensional beings. And when Michelle talks about weight transfer, any direction we can weight transfer is a dimension, and we should be able to weight transfer in all directions. Therefore, we have infinite dimension. It's when you start seeing the breakdown in the movement structure that we start to see people moving with dimension, especially special needs. They start moving with limited dimension. But I just want to show you this and show you how this fits in context with what I'm showing you. And even here, they don't have the complete picture of this tesseract because you can't see it. But what's really cool about the mathematics is that we can see that. So looking at those squares, especially when you're watching when you're watching the next presentation where I just show how I start building this, and I'm just showing the movement planes of development from birth to 12 months. What we really have here is we have this cube, okay? This cube here that is created. And where did I get the dimensions for these cubes? I'm actually going to come back here to, so this is our inner cube. Okay, so I'm actually going to come back here to my spheres. Not my spheres, my cones or cylinders, whatever they call them. I'm going to come back here to my cylinders. Okay, and these specific points here in my cylinders where we have this intersect, okay, is how I'm getting this inner square. Okay, and this is our breath. Okay, so this is the breadth of the system. I have to have breadth so that I can expand and continue to grow. If I start losing my breath, I can't develop beyond what my breath is capable of. And so balance actually fits within breath. Okay, the balance structure fits within the breath structure. Which still even here, like I'm just showing you these points that are significant for establishing the mathematics of breath in the system. Even that structure is a little bit different. So, but at that point of conception, okay, when our seed starts to grow and these cylinders are created in the system, this is where we get our square, okay? But you can see the square as a result of just the rotation, is a shadow of the rotation. So working with this. This is here. And so then too, I'm going to come here and show you this other, makes it so you can see the full thing on there. So there's that. And then unfortunately, because of this program, like I have to put all these tiny thousands of dots here so I can show this in dimension. Show this in dimension, which, you know, I wish I could take all those little dots out to take out confusion, but I just can't because of the program. But when you watch the next video, you'll see that we make the, and I'll show it too in here as well, because in the next video, I show only the half circles of like the box planes, but in here I show you how like they really are complete circles, and it's our weight transfer line within those circles that's going to create the box. So here we have our outer cube, and then you can see these lines here are what they're seeing. These expansion lines are what they're seeing. Okay, and so this is your tesseract. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Okay, but what you can't see is there actually is another cube in here. So I'm going to put this cube in, and this is our balance structure. Okay, so I'm going to go into balance first, even though it's breathing, balance, and heart function. I'm going to go into balance first just because it's inside of the breath. And so therefore our balance cannot exceed the breath because it's within that structure. But because it's within that structure, I'm going to start there first. So you can see how that builds, put the breath structure on it, and then the heart structure, and then I'll put in the rest of the developmental lines. And so here, as we're looking at this now, I made this cube black. So the challenges with what they're seeing is they're actually even missing an inner square of rotation, which is balance. And you wouldn't see it because it's within the other square. And so here I made it black. And so when we're looking at our movement structure, okay, I actually should be getting this three square approach. With the square is just there, it's just the shadows of the rotation. But we don't see it because it's inside of the movement structure. And it's also just it's what's maintaining the balance of the system. And a lot of these things, like obviously they're tangible because we're seeing these geometric shapes in the world and things like that. But at the same time, when we don't know how it begins or how it all comes together, it can make it really hard to interpret what's actually going on. And so that's why, you know, they're talking about limited dimensions when really we should be unlimited dimensional beings. And when we can do that, we can go in any which way direction. And so here I'm gonna layer this out here and come in here really close so you can look at this. But if you look at this inside here, okay, we're getting a square here. So this outer square has to do with our breath. This inner square has to do with our balance, and the balance must maintain itself within the breath of the system. It cannot supersede that. And just to show you where that particular square comes from, now again, it's just a shadow of rotation. So when we're building the actual structure, you're going to see the rotational component of it all. But here, as we look at our movement structure, right here, okay, these key points in the development of the system when we're doing those milestones, this is a really important mathematical point. And often you'll hear Michelle say in her movement reviews, she really talks about like the coming to sitting milestone being missed, the rolling over milestone not being as high quality, and the grabbing the feet milestone being missed. Okay, so rolling over milestone here is this light red. And if that's not setting up, and my child has a form of grabbing the feet, okay, that if I don't have those perfect mathematics, I get an intersect somewhere else in the system, or I don't get one at all, depending. Which without that, I can't go into my coming to sitting milestone. I can't go into those later developments of milestone. Now, even though we're talking about child development, things like that, this relates to things on a quantum level, all the way to, you know, as gargantuan as the universe. Like, we don't use those specific terms of milestones, but it's really cool to be able to give these movement planes a name and kind of the function that they're playing to give us something tangible and conceptual to work with, versus just like, yeah, this is what's happening. Like, we can see the actual movement in the body and what it can do. And so this is really, 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 really important. Now, when we're working with these different cubes, especially with like breathing and balance, okay, I'm really focused on creating the weight transfer of the rotation within these cubes. Now, that's not going to make sense to you. But as you start to understand weight transfer, just make note that this is just a weight transfer line. This is a weight transfer dimension. And we're getting the cubes because it's a specific dimension that sets up in the system. I'm still a multi-dimensional being, but I still need to have that skeletal structure, that foundation to work off of. And so we have more rigid parts of weight transfer that come into play. Okay, so those aren't necessarily as important to know. It's kind of cool. Just because I actually figured that out, and my husband's like, oh, that's the fourth dimension. That's the tetrach. I can't even say it right. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? So a lot of, you know, pretty much all this that I figured out mathematically, I figured it out independently of anything that I've ever seen in like the science books, going from quantum to the universe. Like, I may have seen things like in high school forever ago, but I'm not really relying on that knowledge. Like, Michelle gave a movement process, and I just am strictly following her movement process. I studied the Earth and its rotational movement because I'm like, well, that's the best thing that I have. And then I observed things like black holes, atoms, things like that, and came to conclusions. I drew pictures, and it wasn't really till after the fact where I found those pictures of what people have observed. They've seen those observations, seen those things, or came to the same conclusions, but they couldn't complete the conclusions because they're still trying to apply the laws of motion versus laws of movement. So now looking at our balance, I'm going to zoom on this closer because this outer part really doesn't matter right now as far as doing balance. We're really working in on this inner circle. And again, I can't erase those dots. So when we're working on balance, okay, this is a weight transfer line. So when we're working with balance in the system needs to go along each of these coordinates of the cube. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in these balls of rotation that go along these weight transfer lines. And really the significance of the weight transfer line, it just shows significance to the way that the system is rotating to manage really just anything in the system. We see it a lot in the heart with fluids, things like that, fluid dynamics. But it's sitting up that rigidity in the system and just how everything should flow together. Okay, whether it's electromagnetics, fluid dynamics, all those kinds of things. And again, you're like, well, what does that have to do with my kid? Okay, like if we don't have this structure, like they just can't go into functional movements. They can't go into self-help skills, independence. And so the better we create these foundations, the more functional your child can become. And the more severe your child is in their movement dysfunction, well, then the more you have to work on these things. Now, again, as a beginner, you're not going to be working on this to this technical amount of detail, but I still want to show you that it's there to just help give you the oomph you need to have more faith in sticking with learning the concepts and trying them and just going by faith. Because you may not understand this for a long time, you may not understand it ever, okay? But you can just be like, okay, conceptually, you showed me that it worked. I've got something tangible to take these concepts with and go with. But I'm just more of an intuitive person and I can feel this. But now I understand why it's working versus just taking your word for it. Circles here. We're going to start working with the balance structure. And what's really cool is I really tried to color coordinate these in relationship to just what they're working with, whether it's our horizon plane, front and back plane, driving plane. Like this is really crucial for setting up our internal GPS system, like Michelle says, setting up that internal gyroscope. And as we have our breathing, balance, and heart function, it allows for the actual movement part of the body to be more functional. It's setting that up. Now, again, all this should be there at the moment of conception. And so when it's not, this all happens instantaneously together as the movement body starts growing and using the resources around it. What's powerful about movement lesson is, at that seed level, that roadmap level, blueprint level, is we just have to go in and manually start putting in these movements because it's not happening on its own in the system. Is there the potential to change the actual blueprint? Like, yeah, I think that's possible. At the same time, that's not something we could ever claim. But it also comes down to someone's belief. And really, if that is something that should happen, that would be getting into religious context, which I'm not going to go there. Just personal beliefs, which gives me more understanding of this, but I'm not going to go there. You don't have to be religious or anything for this. Like it's still mathematical, what I'm showing you here, but more just saying that, when the blueprint of your child hasn't set up right, you can go in and manually give your child these experiences as if the blueprint had been perfect. Okay. And therefore you're optimizing the system, allowing it to become more functional, more capable of doing things at a movement level versus having to be worn down by motion and just get worn out by motion. So I'm going to keep those there, but we're going to come here into balance. So something I want to point out as far as looking at this now, as far as going into like breathing and balance, I don't color code those as much in relationship to to the movement planes. Whereas with the heart structure, I will have that a little bit more color coded. But as we look at these mathematics, these planes need to be set up perfectly to create these squares and the coordinates needed within the weight transfer lines to create balance and breathing functions. Okay, so I'm just going to go over balance as far as like some technicality things. I'm not going to do it again in breathing as far as when we're making the circles, things like that. But I want you to look at this here. Here I have my cube, right? And I'm going to take that cube away. And here I just have the line structures of the cube. Now, what's really important is you look at the movement structure, the coordinates within these cubes, the center of my circles, okay, are in the very center of the line of the cube, but it matches up with where I have intersect points of the various planes. Now, again, this can be too technical and mathematical. The point that you need to get from this is that the coordinates need to be there. These planes need to be set up. So if you're setting up these planes in the system as you go through the individual courses, as a byproduct, you're automatically working on balance. You're automatically working on breathing functions. Like you're enhancing those things, and we can work on those things with more intent. But even when you're just like, I don't know what I'm doing there, like these things work because it's setting up the interior necessities of the system to have the structure of movement, breathing, balance, and heart function being the most important. And so this is just showing really key points where these movement planes need to be lining up. Even here, looking at my square and getting the very center, okay, of my square, of which we're going to create our rotations from, intersects with, you know, here's our grabbing the feet plane, horizon plane, like, and things like that. So looking at these segments, now when we're making our structure, okay, our breathing structure is going to, the center of our breathing structure is here in the center of our square. If I look at my cube, okay, the center of my cube, I got my coordinates all lined up here. But this is a weight transfer line, okay, so meaning that the rotation of this balance structure is going to be in this direction. Okay, if I were looking at it straight on, the rotation would be coming towards me. Since, I mean, I didn't color coordinate these, but they do coordinate with, you know, things that are going along these particular parts of my square, coordinate with my driving plane, okay? Here going along the sides of the square would coordinate with my horizon plane, and then coming on this sides of the squares, those are going to coordinate with my front and back plane. Those are going to help set up the system when they're being influenced by that. So I'm just going to keep it red for easiness sake, because the colors just start kind of getting confusing. Okay, so when we're looking at these and just going here in particular, let me see if I can make this show up right. So these particular ones would coordinate as far as their rotation and weight transfer, okay, would be influencing and working with this driving plane. You can see how I'm just going around that. And let me see how I did this here. Then went along those other parts of the cube, which would be going with my front and back plane. And now you can see that I have the sides of my cubes, these weight transfer lines that we need to work with, and those would associate with the horizon plane, okay? Now I leave the cube in there because it's not that I have a square, it's the structure of a square is created due to this weight transfer that we're getting within these rotational planes, okay? And you know, a ball is meant to move in all directions. A square is meant to create stability, and a perfect square for that matter. So here we have our balance structure in the system. So then when, you know, we're setting up these planes of movement, it's reorganizing the balance in the system automatically. So it's okay that you don't know what balance is. It's okay that you don't know what breath is, even if you're like, I've done the course, I don't know how to attack that more. You want to increase balance, you increase the correctness of the mathematics, or you increase the integrity of the mathematics of the system, especially in these foundational milestones. It doesn't, we can work on later milestone planes, but those don't matter as much as these first elemental planes, because of how it's setting up the system for function. So coming into here, now we have balance. Okay, so this is our balance structure and how it directly coordinates with these movement planes. So now if we go into breathing, let's see, I'm going to make that other cube live. So that's our most inner cube. Okay. Well, for our breath, now when we have our breath functions, we want to work on that second cube. So here, I mean, you can only just barely see the corners of it, okay? So here's our inner cube, here's our outer cube. Might have to strain your eyes a little bit. Try to give you some different angles here. You can see the corners of it. But now we're gonna go and do the same thing with our breath structure, okay? The breath structure has to go along with these weight transfer lines, or these dimension lines. And how we would correlate them with the specific planes would be the same way based on the direction that we're working on. So here, working with our breathing, okay, our breathing structure, which it's very similar to the balance structure. actually almost exactly the same, except our rotation is a little bit bigger. Okay. So this is showing your your breath structure, but the balance within the breath. So my balance cannot supersede the breath. So the less breath I have, the less balance that I have. So when you increase breath, you increase balance. And that tends to be a really hard concept for parents to get because they're like, well, why? Well, this is why. And so the balance works within the breath structure. Here you can see our, our cubes in there, but they're just weight transfer lines, and they're just creating structure to the system. Now I can make this way more complicated and show you how all the different rotational things work. I'm not even drawing the rotational lines on here, just the circles represent rotation. Trying to keep this as simple as possible, even though it's still really complex. But still, it's not to overwhelm you, it's to just give you some understanding of like, okay, this works. Like, I can go by faith. So then our last part is the heart structure and how it works within this. And so the heart structure actually encompasses our breathing and balance structure. And when we say heart structure, we automatically think of the heart, which, like, yes, in a sense, like, is there, but it's more of the heart structure of the rotational mechanisms that should be happening within our system, and how it should all be interrelating within ourselves, even to the components of the heart. But even just as you look at our bodies as a whole, this was the center of the pelvis, okay? And you're looking at this big sphere around ourselves, like really this area outside of myself, okay, almost like atmosphere type thing, would come into play of this heart structure and how the rotational system should be working around me, okay, for me to receive and to express rotational movement. So that's more advanced. Again, you don't have to remember that. But now as we're looking at heart structure, we're just going to build that here. So here we have the heart structure. Now I made this a lot lighter. I did color coordinate this a little bit. This is red, okay? These two are purple, just because it interacts with the tummy time plane, the blue. And so it just goes the color because I mixed the two. But this is our heart structure that goes along the horizon plane. And then I'm gonna add the few parts for the driving plane, the heart structure that goes around the driving plane. So now if I'm looking at this from the side, see, red and blue make purple. So you can see that a little bit better. And then we're going to add in here the front and back plane of the heart structure. So when I'm looking at the front and back plane, okay, you can see here that it actually it goes in between these 2 points, these two parts and pieces of the heart structure along the horizon plane. Now, again, that's not really necessary for you to know, but it's actually really important for creating the wobble and maintaining rotational functions in the system. I'm not going to get into that, but here I just want you to show you this structure, and this whole thing like allows for electromagnetics to work, fluid dynamics to work, any of those things of function. This is how it all comes together on a teeny tiny scale to a very massive scale. And it's how it works within our bodies, within the heart itself. Okay, I'm saying heart structure, but just as our body as a whole, and all these different parts and pieces have combined. So if we look here at the third law of movement, a body can remain a single body or bind to one or more other bodies to increase force magnitude in all directions to allow for more complex interaction combinations when using the 6 principles of movement, which you learn about in movement lesson, at least the 6 principles. It's how you use the movement lesson touch. Here again, this is showing you a little bit more dynamic, those colors versus really light, how I was showing you in that program. It's also showing you some of the rotational function here. This is how a single unit of a single body of movement should function. It should have all these key components of breathing, balance, and heart function to allow for the movement structure and that development. But if I want to become more, well, I have to combine with other parts and pieces to create this at a more complex level, even though I'm using a lot of simple components. I'm just using rotation. And it's absolutely fascinating. And so I will just add this as a side note, just for anyone who like comes in and looks at these rotational things. If you get on this front and back plane, this arrows, they're actually opposite. And the way the arrows are coming together, they actually conflict. But this is what allows for like the magnetic poles to flip and just allows for a wobble. So it's actually functional. Here it's just showing you how it all flows together on the opposite side. Only in that one place do we have like have the rotation going against each other, but it's important for flow and things like that. But this is just it takes something simple and allows it to become more complex. Okay, so I'm just really quickly going to now add the rest of the movement structure in here. So in the next video, you're going to see this built without this breathing, balance, and heart function structures on there. But you know, I just think it's really cool to see it all in context of how it works. And that's if it all worked. Okay, so now I'm just really quickly going to add the rest of the structure, showing the peripheral planes, the arc planes, and the box planes in context. The box planes, I actually make a full circle. So you're going to see how we make the last square in the system. So now what I'm going to put in here, and I'm going to put it in a little bit more, hopefully we can see it better here, but I want to do our arc planes. So we're going to do our horizon arc planes. So here you're just looking right here. Okay, so those are our horizon arc planes. You can see here it mirrors a little bit of that heart structure. Now again, in the next video, you'll see them in a little bit more context of what they look like through the center. It's hard because there's so many layers here. But I just got to put it on straight on so you can actually see what's happening here. So then we got our front and back arc planes. So here we're seeing where those come into play. And now the last piece is putting in the box planes. So now with the box planes, I'm actually going to do the full circle instead of only doing half. Okay, so here we're going to do the box planes, and this is making a full circle. Okay. So here's this. I'm actually going to put in the last cube so you can see that. So in the next video, you'll see where I end just here at these points. But it's because I create a weight transfer line in these box planes. And so putting up this last cube, just to give you, I think it just helps you visualize it a little bit more since there's so much messiness going on here. And I call it messiness, like it's actually order. Like this isn't a mess, this is order. And when we're looking at movement, you know, things should be simple, but it doesn't mean that it's not more steps. Okay, so here's our last cube. And you know, that's something that, you know, I really try to work on with my kids. You know, they get frustrated putting things away because they're like, Mom, you're making it more steps than it needs to be. I'm like, no, I'm making it efficient. To be efficient, like there are certain steps that you have to go through. That like that's what systematization is it's not just going from point A to point B, but it's doing it in the fastest, most efficient way possible using these steps. It's doing it in the fastest, most efficient way possible to accomplish the end that needs to be done. So I put this cube in here, okay, just so you can see where that is going to the it's creating that weight transfer line. So now let's just create the rest of our box planes here. Here we go. So here's the bottom. And then we're going to do our driving box planes. and then our front and back box planes. So now if you look at this in its entirety, okay, this is our movement structure and the various types of structure that come within it. So let me see here. And like, this is why movement just happens. Like, to look at an object and be like, oh, all this stuff is happening. No one would ever see that looking from the outside in, is because an atom moves, we move. Like, this is what movement looks like at its starting point. Okay, this is when I found movement lesson, I wanted to know how movement started. And so this is its starting point, being still. And when all these parts and pieces are there and we start to go into movement, I mean, you would never see this again, because it's meant to move, it's meant to function and be dynamic and to be operational and to grow. There's still other structures here, types of rotation that, it's showing how the Fibonacci spiral comes into play, things like that, that I don't have here, that's not relevant to right now. Like, this is just to show the start of movement versus motion. Motion is not organized. It can be chaotic, it can be unpredictable. But when we have things of movement should be predictable. And just because, something's going from point A to point B and I decide to change directions, doesn't mean that it wasn't predictable, but it means that I'm working with a body that has an intelligence to just change direction, to change its mind, to go somewhere different. Michelle talks about one of the milestones, I hear her say this a lot, is rolling over, right? I should, if I have optimal movement in my system, a baby should be able to go into rolling over and then be like, but I actually don't want to, and then come back out of it. Like, I don't have to complete the combination. I can go in and out of movements. And that's why patterning can be challenging, because when a child's getting stuck in a pattern, they that's where you can get stimming coming into play, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But, or if I have to do something the exact same way every time, I can't use variation, I can't use combination. This movement structure is not setting up that when we have the movement structure, I should be dynamic, I should be able to change things up a little bit, but still do it in an organized fashion. I need to maintain the structure in all types of environment, whether I'm internally sick or externally, I have environmental changes. And so this is just, I mean, it's a beautiful thing, and I won't take credit for it. I mean, I have done a lot of sought spiritual guidance in this, of just, how does this work? I do believe in a divine creator, and that he created all things, but he didn't make all things out of nothing. He just had a blueprint that utilized the resources that were there. And I just was like, okay, well, how is that done? Like, what do I do? And this has been developing over years, a combination of years, taking all of Michelle's knowledge that she's shared, and then taking the last few years and just being like, I gotta go deeper. Like, I don't work very well with intuitive if I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I am okay working by faith, but like, I need a little bit more. I need my time to be more valuable to me. Like, I need to work on my kids like Michelle does. So Michelle, like, feels all this. This is just a gift she's been given. She feels all this, she can work with it, she can organize it. So when she's talking about, movement is like, I need to see how movement's organized in your child. Like, this is what she's looking at, and she can go in and pinpoint, oh, like, I mean, in this, I can't even see the rolling over plane in here. Like, and she can be like, oh, your rolling over's off. Like, okay, oh, your breathing's off. Oh, like, you don't have in and out of standing. You don't have those transitional skills. Like, she can just see what's not working. And it's just absolutely amazing. And so, coming to just this presentation again, the last part where we talk about movement, movement is optimal. It's the quickest, most efficient, functional, and organized way to get from point A to point B. And looking, at what movement is, if you can see people do experiments with these But you know, they'll take a ball and, you know, which ball is going to get from point A to point B the fastest. Okay, point A to point B, the fastest, the beginning to the end, the fastest. And I would have thought it was the line, like just go in a straight line. And this is actually the slowest way to do it. Okay, this is the slowest way to get from point A to point B. Is what we think is like the easiest way to do is you just, you know, cut through everything and you just do it. Like that's actually not efficient. Like you have to use rotation, and the more rotation I have, the more efficient I become. This has rotation in it, but it's not consistent rotation, and so it creates a lack of control in like speed and movement, things like that. Whereas when we just have that nice circle, I get to point A to point B the fastest and most controlled way. Okay, so what is motion? Motion is everything that movement isn't. And that's what you're here to learn at movement lesson is being able to discern that. Okay, you're going to take this unit and you're going to start learning this more particularly, you know, the individual lines here, not necessarily going into breathing balance and heart structure components. Okay, but I just want to show you how this fits within the context of that. The next video will just, you know, again, it will just show the building blocks of this and each of the milestones. And as you go through each of the courses, you're literally working on each of these one at a time. So it's not overwhelming. It's one step at a time. You get to learn the technical side and the intuitive side. Like that is the huge value in watching show stuff, is doing the intuitive side of things. And so as you're watching that, really just being mindful of that this isn't to overwhelm you, but this is why it works. And I am going to make this big here, and just the mathematics are there. And so I'm just going to slide through this so you can see. That's what I really love about this program. So it'll take me forever to figure this part of mathematics out. So it just automatically does it. You know, all of these parts and pieces have a coordinate within our XYZ coordinates. Let's see that. You don't need to know. So obviously things that are just here in color have coordinates that go along with it. And this is movement versus motion. This is, you know, as you're looking at your child and you're like, man, why is this not working? We don't have the system set up. So I hope you found that video instructional, and go from there. Thanks.